reflection paintings are always really interesting and a lot of fun to paint. They're relatively simple, especially as far as reflections go. I know we've done at least one before. This one's going to be a little bit more complicated. So let's start with our pre-sketch again. So our horizon line is almost exactly in the middle here. Just like that. And then we've got one large mountain back here. And then we've got kind of a smaller mountain in front of it like this. And then we've got trees. We've got some larger trees here. And then along there. We've got... So this is a relatively evened out landscape here. So we've got our reverse of our trees here. And then our mountains, like so. Alright, so the brush that I am using is a flat brush. We're going to start with our sky. So I'm going to grab some blue here. And I am using kind of a light teal blue. I'm just going to put some color at the top here that we can drag down. Then I'm going to grab some water and do just that. I'm going to drag it straight down. Alright, just like that. We're going to do the same thing down at the bottom, and we're going to end up darkening this a little bit later, but for now I'm just going to use that same color. Just like this. We'll grab some water, spread it out. Now remember, you want the reflection to be pretty close to what you're seeing above, but if it's not exact, that is okay, because the water distorts parts of it anyway, so if it's not looking like it's exactly the same, it'll still look okay. And I'm actually going to put some more color over here that I can spread out. Darken this a tidge. Just a tidge. We'll do more with it later. Alright, now we're going to do that back mountain, and we're going to do that with a darker blue here. So I've got a nice kind of cobalt blue, true blue. We are going to go like this. We're going to want to make sure we get the outline of the mountain here, and mountains aren't usually perfectly straight, so I'm trying to make sure I get some rock coverage in there. And then make sure you're spreading like from this top corner or this top peak kind of outward like this, because then you're following the slope of the mountain. And I'm going to take the color I already have and spread it about. Some kind of rockiness on the other side here too. This front mountain is also blue, but it's a slightly different tone of blue, so it sticks out. But I'm going to take the blue that I already have on this back mountain and kind of spread it through this front one. Take some more colors, I can darken this a little bit. I actually spread it down into this mountain a little bit so that it's easier to get that color there. Now, as you can see, I've kind of lost the slope of this mountain, so I'm going to follow the slope of this mountain to spread that out so that I can try and keep that line. It'll show up a lot more later, but for right now I just want to remember where it is. Alright, and then down below we're going to do something similar. Alright, just like that. And we're going to let that dry a little bit before we do too much more to it. But I am going to add some teal blue to this front part. Now, if you don't have a teal color on your palette, just take your blue and add a little bit of green to it. If it is really dark, if you have dark blue and dark green on your palette, add a little bit of white too, so that it's kind of a lighter teal closer to this. And you only want a little bit of white because you're going to want it kind of dark for this. But this smaller mountain down at the bottom shows through a little bit more teal. And there is some in that top mountain too, but the reflection really shows up to you. So we're just going to do that. And then I'm going to use some more down here so I can get some off of my brush, and then use what's left to add some up on top here. And like I said, it definitely shows through more down in the reflection, but we want to add that teal up on top too, just like this. Alrighty. Now, the reflection of the water has more of a dark blue tone down here. So I'm going to take my dark blue, but very little of it, and then I'm going to rub some off, and I'm going to add, oh, that's too much, add some dark blue up in here, and then spread it out. So, and I have a bit much. That's okay though, I'll just keep spreading it out. Like so, and then lightening it as it gets further down. There we go. Alright, now we got some foreground work to do. So we got some trees and some ground up front. Now our ground up front is kind of a yellowish color and some yellow ochre, so I'm going to grab some yellow, and I've got a little bit of green in my yellow right now, and that's okay for this. If you're doing something where you need yellow, you'll have to wipe it off, but now I'm mostly just putting down color on where this horizon line is. Alright, now green. And most of these are pine trees, which we did learn in our last one. So we've got some taller ones here, like so. And then we've got a bunch of little guys along here, and then some taller ones on this side again. Just like that. And then we're just gonna do some horizontal lines like this. Make them nice and kind of jagged looking. You don't want it to be real crisp lines, because that's not what pine trees look like, right? They're kind of sharp, pointy looking. Just start at the bottom and work your way up. Doing some scribble work here. Make sure you keep that peak a little bit. I kind of lost a couple of mine. I can add that back in, but and it's a lot easier to do these little trees if you have more of a dry brush, so that you're getting some smaller lines. right. Now we're going to do the ones at the bottom. We want them to be roughly the same as the top here. And because I just had to grab more paint, I'm doing the larger trees again because I want my brush to be more dried out when I get to these little guys here. You can just go back and forth like that, using up some of the paint on the bigger guys, and then coming into the smaller ones. All right. Now, yep, the back mountains are a little bit more dry, so we are going to go in and do some detail work with white because we've got some snow caps on that back mountain there. So I'm going to grab my white. Right, and we are going to do some kind of dabbing going down like this. You want to make sure that top part gets hit and then kind of follow that slope down like this. Make sure some blue still shows through because it doesn't cover all of it, right? So this is another process that is easier to do with other tools, but is not impossible to do just using the exact same brush that we started with. So we don't need any extra tools or specific brushes, palette knives, things like that. All you need is one brush and some paint. And even when I'm doing my personal paintings, I use the same, like, super cheap palettes of paint that you can buy for my large scale paintings that I actually sell. So don't worry about what kind of paint you have. You don't have to have a super fancy brand. Sometimes you can see the difference in acrylic, but when it comes to watercolors, you really don't. So Alright, now I am going to grab some water and rinse off my brush. And then I'm going to dry it. Not completely, but wipe off all the excess water. And then we're going to start at the top and just kind of follow that slant down. Now this is something that's more of a choice. You can leave it more rough if you prefer it that way, or you can blend it out a little bit. I'm not really going to do it down at the bottom because we're going to end up adding in our water lines anyway, so. And then some of the really white spots on that peak I'm going to hit again because it does grab a lot of that undertone of blue. So like up here, it is the nature of watercolors to grab the color that's underneath. So you can't really paint in thick layers the way that you would with like acrylic paint. Alright, now I am going to grab black. We are going to use that for these trees. Now, first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to follow this horizon line here. I'm going to add in some black. You don't want one thick line, you just want to add it in like so. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side of that yellow here. Alright, now we're going to put it into our trees. You don't want a ton of black on your brush. A little bit goes a long way. So this is one of those instances where, especially if you have like an extra piece of paper that you can just wipe it on, or on the edge of your palette, so you can get it a little bit more dry, because we're going to put it over the green here like this. And we want that green to still show through. And we're going to put more green over it, but we don't want to lose everything we did with that first coat, right? This will make it so that when you put the greens back over it, you've got some shadows underneath. But the reason why we don't want to have a ton of that black on the brush, why we want it to be kind of dry, is because just like where the white picked up all of that blue underneath, when you put the green on there, it's going to pick up all the black and your trees are going to be really dark. Got a little too much water on that time. Gotta dry it out a little bit. All right, so now we are going to take a slightly darker green. So I'm actually going to take my green and mix a dab of blue into it because I don't want it to be super, super dark, and black will make things really dark and really dull really fast. So I'm just put some blue in it. We're going to go over the top, but instead of doing straight lines, we're going to kind of dab those lines back and forth like this. So just like this. So instead of swiping, you're just dabbing it on there. Just make sure you're following the same shape of that tree and that back and forth motion, and you'll start to get your pine trees. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what a pine tree is, it's the ones with the little needles on it, like a Christmas tree, that create that triangle shape, come to a little point at the top. The ones that drop those pine cones. These little guys are going to be a lot less defined because it's just a cluster of a whole bunch of them. I'm going to go along and do some down at the bottom here to try and touch those black lines in that shadow and make sure that I don't have a whole bunch of white showing through there. Keep going here. Whoop. Make sure you do your bottom trees too. Don't forget to make sure that you keep the point at the top of your tree because they come to kind of a sharp little point. And that will help make it look more realistic. So you can do this kind of dabbing motion with all of your layers, like the light green and the black that we put down already. But this is a very tedious process, so this just kind of speeds it up a little bit more. But you will get a more realistic looking tree if you just do many, many layers of this kind of quick dabbing motion. Because what it does is it makes it look like the light is catching on all the tiny little needles in that tree. I'm just going to kind of fill in a little bit down here because I didn't bring my mountain down enough, so I've got a lot of white showing through. Since this is the reflection, it's going to get blurred out anyway, so I'm okay just adding little dots of green in there. Alright, now we're going to grab a real light green. So what I'm doing is I'm actually going to take my green and I'm going to add it to my yellow so I get like a bright lime green. Kind of a neon color. And we're going to add that to the trees, but only a little bit, because what we want is we want it to look like the light catching the very, very tops of them and some of the little needles. You can also mix your green with your white, but what you're going to get is kind of more of a pastel green, and I want to keep my colors pretty bright for this one. So I'm just going to follow one side of these trees so that I'm deciding my light is coming from over here. When you're painting something, most of the shades are going to be somewhere in the middle. You're not going to get a lot that's the lightest color, and you're not going to have a lot that's the darkest color. So that's why that black went down first and we went over it, and that's why this we're just doing a little bit over the top. Most things are kind of a happy medium. Most of the shades that you'll see when something is casting a shadow are going to be somewhere in that happy medium. Unless you have extreme light. It's really, really, really dark, or it's really, really, really light. Alright, now we're going to do the same thing at the bottom. Once again, our light source is coming from over here. So we want to make sure we keep that same direction. These back trees, it's mostly just important to get that little bit of light on the very, very tippy top of that tree. Alright, now we're going to put some details in the ground along here. So I'm going to grab my yellow ochre again. So just a reminder, if you add a little dash of brown into your yellow, you'll get this color. And it's just kind of a dull, kind of burnt yellow color. Looks like dried grass, which is exactly what we want it to look like. And we're going to add some dabs in here on either side of this yellow. On the thinner spot, it's going to kind of take over the yellow, and that is fine. Yellow is just that background color so that we don't have a bunch of white showing through, remember. And then I'm just going to swish it up a little bit so that we get some little blades of grass kind of showing in the background. There we go. Now I'm going to grab a brown, and I'm actually just keeping that yellow ochre color on my brush as I grab that brown so that it's kind of a mid-tone brown. And we're going to do that right in between these two, because this half is actually the reflection, and there's a bit of a shadow in between. Dab it along, and then we are going to do very, very, very little on this top part here, just to add some depth to that grass, like this. Just little dots, and you can kind of rotate your brush so that they're pointing different directions as you go. Do the same thing down on the bottom here. Now you don't see as much of it in that reflection, so now I'm going to get some black, but I'm going to add a little bit of white to it because I actually want more of a gray. This time I am washing off my brush because I don't want the brown in there. Alright, now we are going to do kind of a straight line in between right there. Then we're going to do something similar right here. We're going to follow the bottom of this thinner chunk here with that gray. Then we're going to grab some actual black. We're going to do the same thing over the top of the gray, but even less of it, because we want that gray to show through, right? There we are. Alright, now I'm going to add some clouds in my sky here, so I'm going to grab my white again, and we're going to do some little cumulus clouds this time. Those are those fluffy ones. I'm just gonna kind of dab them like that. You don't want it to be perfectly shaped because the clouds tend to look very different. That's why you can see shapes in them like animals and stuff, right? If you have to do a couple of layers to get the white to show through, that is fine. And some little guys kind of down here behind the trees. I'm going to do the same thing in the water here. And you want there to be about 1-to-1. They don't have to be exactly the same, like I said, but you want there to be, there's a cloud here, so there's a cloud on the reflection. It doesn't have to be the exact same shape, but you want there to be the same number of clouds. And roughly the same size, too. Alright, now we're going to do the water. Now this part is always fun. So what we're going to do is we are actually going to blur the bottom. So I'm just taking my clean brush, no paint on it, and just putting water on it. You don't want a ton because you don't want it to create a puddle when you touch down. But what we're going to do is you're just going to follow this horizon line, and kind of like we did with the trees, we're just going to go back and forth like this. And we're going to add some lines in here, and what it's doing is it's taking the paint that's already there and it's kind of moving it around. And you're going to want to rinse your brush pretty regularly so you don't end up with the green from the trees kind of leaking into the mountains and so forth. And we got some blurring happening here. You don't want to rub it so much that you lose all of your different shades here, because you don't want it to all run together, but you want it to look distorted. So like if you look at your reflection in the water and it's perfectly still water, it'll look like you're looking in a mirror, but then if you drop a stone into the water, it'll ripple. And so that's what we're creating the effect of right here, is those ripples in the water. Just like so. And then what we can do if you want, so the picture has pretty still water, so you don't see more than just the blurred image. But if you want it to look even more rippled, what you can do, I'm shifting everything around here, is actually take a little bit of white and just add some lines, and you want to make sure it follows that same horizon line here. But then it'll look like the light is catching the water as it ripples. You can go right over the top of any part you feel like adding it to. Now if you do too much of that, it's going to look like some pretty crazy water, but I encourage you to play around with it, see how it goes. And there we are.